surprise U-turn amid an unprecedented crisis. Hong Kong's leader withdraws the extradition bill that sparked mass demonstrations, but protesters say it's too little too late. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Chief Executive Carrie Lam. It was a concession aimed at stopping what the government calls violence and chaos, a carefully picked olive branch offered in the hope of de-escalation. But aside from a pause out of respect for the anniversary of 9/11, protesters haven't gone anywhere. Killing the bill was just one of 5 demands. The most pressing, an inquiry into violence by police, who've increasingly relied on water cannon, tear gas, rubber bullets and beatings. Beijing maintains the demonstrators are backed by foreign powers, a perception not helped by American flag-waving protesters calling for Trump to liberate them, or activist Joshua Wong meeting German leadership in Berlin. But Hong Kongers have consistently asked for the same thing since the handover: democratic freedoms. So, despite Carrie Lam's wishes, the standoff still seems far from over. Natalie Perhonen reports.
Hong Kong's summer of protest has entered another season. It's the start of a new school year. The city's leaders may have hoped a return to class would mean a return to normal life, but there's no indication the unrest will end soon. The mass demonstrations began in June as peaceful protests against a bill that would have allowed extraditions to mainland China. They've morphed into public anger. There's also been an escalation in violence. Chief Executive Carrie Lam had refused to give any ground to the protesters. Then came this announcement last week.
The government will formally withdraw the bill in order to fully allay public concerns.
For many, this concession has come too late, and the situation has evolved beyond the extradition bill. As protests grew over the past 3 months, so have protesters' calls for reform. Their original demand has grown to 5. So far, the government is refusing to concede on these issues: an independent inquiry into police conduct, for officials to drop the description of protests as riots, amnesty for arrested protesters, and universal suffrage, that is, fully democratic elections. The demonstrations are continuing on a daily basis.
Fight for freedom!
The protest movement is leaderless. It means there are no identifiable individuals for the government to negotiate with. Despite that, Lam says she's ready for dialogue with the public to help restore peace. But is there anything more she can offer the protesters will accept? Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, earlier I spoke to Carrie Lam's senior advisor, Ronny Tong. I began by asking him whether Lam should have withdrawn the bill months ago.
No, I think from the government point of view, there is no meaningful material difference between what the chief executive had previously said and what she has now said that she would do when LegCo open its coming term. But I think it is a show of sincerity, and I hope that the show of sincerity would be appreciated by the protesters so that the two sides can come together and try to work out our differences.
Well, despite the fact that it's a show of sincerity, many of the protesters not backing down, most of them saying this is about much more than just the law, it's much bigger than the law. Do you accept that they have 5 very legitimate demands?
No, I think you're right to say some of them do not accept. But I think if you look at what is happening over the last few days, the number of people coming out has been falling, although some of the conduct of some of the protesters has somewhat escalated. But we're still working on very hard to try to bring the two sides together. Insofar as the demands of the protesters are concerned, everyone knows that at least 2 of them can't be accepted by any responsible government because they offend against the rule of law. These has to deal with releasing everyone who had been arrested or charged with criminal offenses, and the demand that their conduct cannot be looked at as riots.
Okay, so let's set aside the amnesty for protesters and look at one of the other demands linked to that, where they want an investigation into police violence. We've seen from the outside, with our own eyes, heavy-handedness from the police. Why are you so afraid? Why are you so afraid to have an investigation into that?
First of all, the government is not afraid. Quite the contrary. There is an ongoing investigation by the Independent Police Consultation Committee. In fact, experts from all over Europe have been invited to join in with the panel to look at the conduct of the police over the last 3 months. So, there is a legal and proper channel at the moment looking into the conduct of the police. But I think I'm right to say that if things were to quiet down and there is a cessation of violent acts in the streets, I'm quite sure some kind of investigative inquiry would be on foot, when the conditions are right. But clearly, at this moment, you can't really expect people to come to any kind of inquiry with petrol bombs in their hands. So the first thing we need to tackle with is to restore an order in the streets. I hope that all the violence would stop or cease. And then I'm sure there would be some kind of inquiry over and above the current inquiry as to the conduct of the police.
Is Beijing happy with the way your administration has handled the protests?
I have no inside information, but various media has reported Beijing is not very happy with the performance of this administration, in particular, Carrie Lam, but I'm not quite sure whether that represents the truth. What I do know is that Beijing had, on every occasion, whenever possible, said that they are fully behind Carrie Lam. They are very supportive of what the administration is doing, and they're doing what they can to ensure that the current administration will be in the position to restore law and order in Hong Kong.
There are those who fear that Beijing will send in mainland troops to put down the protest movement. If China decided to do that, would you support it?
No, I can assure you that everyone in Hong Kong, and I'm talking about the administration, do not want any kind of physical intervention from Beijing. And I can also tell you, as far as I know from my contacts, Beijing doesn't want that to happen either. But I think, like any responsible government, either the Beijing administration or the Hong Kong administration would have to be prepared for the worst. If things were really getting out of control, then there has to be some measure to be brought in to ensure that law and order can be restored. But I think at this moment, this is far from happening, and I'm sure everyone, including Beijing and Hong Kong, is working very hard to ensure that that wouldn't happen.
There was leaked audio where Carrie Lam was saying she wanted to resign but couldn't. Give us some clarity here. Is that what happened? She wanted to resign, she came close to resigning, but perhaps Beijing twisted her arm and said, you have to stay.
No, I don't think that is right. I think the chief executive has openly explained, I think more than once in front of television, that is not the case. What she meant was that, had she the choice, she might have taken the easy way out, but she felt that she is fully committed to Hong Kong. That being the case, she found herself without any alternative but to continue with her work. Now, that had nothing to do with what Beijing thinks. I think this is only her, internal struggle, as it were.
Ronny Tong, good to have you on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. Well, for a very different take on what's happening in Hong Kong, let's speak to law professor Benny Tai. He was jailed earlier this year for his role in organizing the 2014 Umbrella Movement protests. He was put in solitary confinement for going on strike. and he's just been released on bail pending an appeal. Good to have you on the program. Sir, anything that you heard from Ronny Tong there sound reasonable to you?
Well, I think he might not, and I think like the administration of Carrie Lam, most of the people in the government could not really understand the present situation. I think the most important thing we are facing now is a legitimacy crisis of the government. I think even though Carrie Lam has openly decided to withdraw the bill, but you can see that over Hong Kong, I think at this very moment, we still have protesters all around Hong Kong protesting in a very peaceful way, singing a new song made by Hong Kong people. Actually, this is the legitimacy crisis that the Hong Kong government is facing. And without independent inquiry, without the introduction of universal suffrage, I cannot see any chance of resolving this crisis.
They hang a question mark of legitimacy over the protesters as well. As he told me, we can't cave into the demands of people with petrol bombs. That's how he defines the protesters. Would you accept that it is possible to look within the protesters and say that, yes, there were some unsavory elements and there were some people, radical aspects of those protests that made things worse?
Well, I think in every movement of this scale, you will have protesters who adhere to the nonviolent principles, and also you have protesters who may resort to more radical means. But I think the more important thing that, as I think everyone knows, is a leaderless movement, and the only way you can end this the present situation is that the government put forward concrete suggestions that can address the 5 demands of all protesters, no matter you're talking about the nonviolent or you're talking about the more radical protesters. And unless the government can satisfy all these demands, I don't see there's any chance of getting an end of this whole crisis now.
Yeah, Benny Tai, why not enjoy the victory of getting one of those demands for the moment and then recalibrate and re-strategize to try and get the other 4?
Well, you have to understand the extradition bill. That's the controversial bill. I think the why it was controversial was not just because the content of the bill, but because why such a bill came in at the very beginning. And if we could not have the universal suffrage, have our chief executive being elected by Hong Kong people directly, then we will have similar kinds of bills be put forward by the chief executive. Even it might not be Carrie Lam or by other chief executive elected in the same undemocratic methods.
Yeah, we saw the booing of the Chinese anthem at a football game recently, people using it as a setting for political protest. And it's interesting because there's a new proposed law that would punish anyone who, quote, publicly and intentionally insults the national anthem with up to 3 years in prison and a fine of a few $1,000s. It seems as if, despite that, there's been a shift, right? There's the birth of a fearlessness, a fearless Hong Kong nationalism over the past 3 months or so. Have we reached a point of no return between those who want Hong Kong to be completely separate and those who want Hong Kong to still be part of one country, 2 systems?
I think it's not yet up to that point, but it may be close. It may be close. And that's also why it's important that the Hong Kong government and also the Chinese government must act fast to satisfy the 5 demands, especially the introduction of universal suffrage. And if not, I can see the rise of this kind of Hong Kong nationalism over Hong Kong very fast.
Benny Tai, good to have you on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's debate it now. Emily Lau was a member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council and chairwoman of the Democratic Party. And in Beijing is Qinduo, a China affairs analyst and senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, a public policy think tank. Good to have you both join the discussion. Emily Lau, it seemed as if this concession was a victory for the protesters, but as I mentioned, they're not treating it that much as a victory. Do you accept that tactic?
Yeah, I think it's very little and it's very late. And I think Carrie Lam has to look harder at the other demands made by not just the radical protesters, but by many, many Hong Kong people, including myself, who have all my life supported, advocated peaceful and nonviolent protests. And our demands are very reasonable and they are within the one country, two systems. So I think that not just Carrie Lam, but the people in Beijing should look at that and try to reach out to the people. And I think that because people really want to put an end to this unrest that's been going on for several months. And of course, the economy is being very hard hit. And the business people, look at their pocketbooks. They're all suffering. So I certainly think that the government should come out and try to get an end to this saga.
Qinduo, Beijing, warning that Western black hands are meddling in the crisis. Do you believe that?
Yes. Well, if you look at the U.S., the remarks by U.S. officials, President Trump linking Hong Kong issue to the trade war, and also Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, and also Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, Marco Rubio, etc., the senators, what they say about Hong Kong, of course, that's an intervention of Hong Kong affairs. And you see Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily, being received by Michael Pompeo, the Secretary of State, John Bolton, Security Advisor, former, and also the Vice President Michael Pence, a civilian being received by the top officials in Washington. If that's not intervention, what's interference, you know?
So,
and don't tell me they are receiving,
so let me add something
for
to
example, the opposition figures.
Okay. Let me add something to that. So Emily Lau, we saw in the Financial Times an op-ed, right, where the Republican leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, wrote this op-ed saying America must respond to the pleas of Hong Kong's people. Congress needs to pass an act allowing the U.S. to impose sanctions on China. And he's talking about the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019, supported by many of the protesters. When a senior American official, a senior congressman writes that sort of thing, isn't it harming the protesters? Because the Chinese can say, you see, the Americans want regime change here.
Well, the thing is, human rights transcend national boundaries. I certainly hope that the American politicians will speak out on human rights violations in other places as well. And if they want to look at Hong Kong, and I think many Hong Kong people would like to see that act pass, so it would target individuals who undermine or who violate human rights. I think when I speak for many Hong Kong people who are very happy to see that happening. And when I was in London in July, I went to the House of Commons. I spoke to members of Parliament, and I urged them to pass similar acts in the UK and also elsewhere. I think people who harm human rights, who violate human rights, they should be punished anywhere, everywhere. I think human rights transcend national boundaries. And it's not a question of interfering in anybody's internal affairs.
Okay, so Xu Qinduo, when the Chinese are angry that Germany is giving Joshua Wong a platform to speak his mind, what's your problem with that? That's not Germany interfering in Hong Kong. They're saying, okay, we want to listen to this guy who's a protester. No more, no less.
Remember what happened in Turkey, like opposition figure, the religious figure, like hiding in the United States. Turkish people are not happy with that because basically that's a way of supporting the opposition party. Joshua Wong being received by the foreign minister of Germany, that's not the nicest way to say, hey, I'm not interfering in your internal affair. I'm just meeting this guy. Obviously, that's not. But that's not a big issue. I wouldn't say that's a big issue. U.S. threatening China
but the Chinese picking up the
adopting
phone
this Hong Kong
certainly,
Human Rights
but the Chinese picking up the phone and calling the ambassador.
That will hurt Hong Kong.
They're making a big deal out of it, right? By reacting angrily, aren't they making a bigger deal out of it? Nobody would have known. Fewer people would have known Joshua Wong was actually in Germany unless the Chinese got angry about it.
No. Of course, I think they have every reason to be angry, and the ambassador or the Chinese diplomats, pick up the phone and make a phone call to the foreign ministry. They are doing their job. And of course, because Germany, by doing that, they are interfering in the Chinese affairs. And out of disrespect, this is very bad and to the bilateral relationship between Germany and China. I think they should know better about that, because foreign intervention will not help solve the problem in Hong Kong. I'm not sure the foreign minister of Germany has ever condemned the violence in Hong Kong. You see the violence every day in the TV screen, and why don't people say anything about that?
Okay, Emily Lau, I want us all to look at what the administration is doing right now. We got a little bit of insight into the thinking in that interview that I conducted with Ronny Tong, where he said that, yes, we will have an inquiry into police actions once the protests end, once things calm down. This administration's going nowhere. They seem to be looking at it from the perspective of riding it out, right? They're trying to wait this out and hoping it will die down. Is that going to work, Emily?
Well, I think Ronny should know that many Hong Kong people, including many people in the legal fraternity, have asked for an independent inquiry. So the thing is, even if you say we will set it up now, it's not as if it's immediately going to start working. You need to decide the terms of reference, to appoint the commissioners and so on. But we want to see it started. And that's the wish of the overwhelming majority of Hong Kong people. And so I hope Ronny Tong will tell Carrie Lam and the others that they should get on with it rather than to sit there and ride it out.
Qinduo, is there appetite within the mainland among the people? You're closer to the story there than I am. Is there appetite for China to be a bit harsher on the Hong Kong protesters, or to get behind or order Carrie Lam to do more and to be more heavy-handed?
Well, first of all, there's a little the Beijing government can do. Remember, there's one country, two systems, and the Hong Kong people governing Hong Kong, and also Hong Kong enjoying a high degree of autonomy. That's the principle. For Beijing, Beijing would wish, would love, would be happy to see the success of the one country, two system. Of course, it's not in Beijing's interest to interfere in the Hong Kong affairs. Remember. So secondly, it's really up to the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong people to solve their problem. And first of all, I do agree with the Hong Kong government. With the withdrawal of the bill, let's stop the violence. Let's restore the law and order. Is there anything wrong with that? And the opposition parties, they're blaming the Hong Kong government. But what are they doing? Are they condemning the violence? Are they calling for the restoration of law and order? I think there's a good faith already shown by the government. I think it's up to the protesters to also to show the spirit of compromise. Let's step back a little bit and let's shake hands. Let's sit down and see how we can solve this problem. I think Hong Kong's benefit, if Hong Kong's issue can be resolved peacefully, that's not only in the interest of Hong Kong, that's also in the interest of the Chinese and of China. We would love to see that being solved peacefully.
Okay, Emily Lau, final response from you, ma'am.
Yeah, of course. I think it is definitely in the interest of Hong Kong and in the interest of China to see the Hong Kong issue resolved peacefully. But Carrie Lam herself said in this tape that was leaked by Reuters, saying that she had very little room to maneuver because she served two masters, and is the master in Beijing, which is telling her what to do and what not to do. So I think Beijing should understand that if we resolve this peacefully, then it is definitely in the interest of Beijing. And Beijing has so many other problems to attend to. But when German Chancellor Angela Merkel was in Beijing a few days ago, she mentioned Hong Kong several times. When the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, when he was in Japan, he mentioned Hong Kong. When the President of the Philippines, Duterte, after visiting China, he went back to Manila, he mentioned Hong Kong. Everybody mentioned Hong Kong all the time, in a very negative way. So I hope Beijing will try to resolve it peacefully and quickly.
Okay, Emily Lau and Qinduo, pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers, as well as Benny Tai and Ronny Tong earlier on to talk Hong Kong once again. That's it for now on the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out full shows and other content on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Until next time, hey, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.